Hello, everybody. My name is Connole, and welcome back once again to another edition of the Movie Battleground. In tonight's matchup, we have two competitors, one of which has all the stakes, the other has none, and that would be myself. So this is one of those matches where if you've seen previous matches, it helps you understand why this is happening. But if not, I'll give you the equivalent of a previously on. In John's first match of the year, he beat Jeremy Adams to go 4-1. And after some impressive wins and, of course, an impressive record, I told John that should he win his next matchup, he would get a number one contenders match. Then John proceeded to show up to a Ryan Johnson exhibition match, give no fucks, and still play well despite the fact that he gave no fucks. And so I told him that his reward for that would be he's playing me for that chance at that number one contenders match. Now, I don't mean to toot my own horn here, but if you count the win that's technically not on my record, I am 3-0 this year, including taking down a former title contender and whatever you want to call Papa West. So I'm not a slouch in my own league, and I do feel like if John beats me tonight, which quite honestly I feel there's a very good chance he will, he's going to earn this opportunity, or at the very least, I'm going to make him work for it. With that said, there's only one competitor to interview because I'm myself. Obviously, I am hosting. Our original host was unavailable to be here, so I'm just doing that as well. And it'd be weird for me to just talk to myself any longer than I already do. So, introducing my opponent, coming in with a record of 4 wins, 1 defeat, and 1 knockout, he is Calamity, John Maher. John, welcome. How are you doing?
Great, Aaron. I didn't realize that this was a punishment match, but I will do my best to accept the punishment and still compete as best I can against you.
Yeah, I mean, this is the only punishment where if you win, you get a reward, but that's parenting, right?
Yeah, that is parenting. Yeah, being a parent myself, that is exactly, you try to instill lessons in your children, though I am considerably older than you, so I have to take that as disrespect.
As you should. No, man. Obviously, you had a lot of hype behind you last season, going 3-1. You took down Austin Howell, who obviously went on to become a title contender in a match. You also took down Chris Diaz in one of the weirdest experiences I think anyone's ever had. And of course, your win against Jeremy earlier this year cemented you as like, okay, you can take on more than just the newer people. You can also take on kind of the elder statesman of the league and someone like Jeremy. So I guess mentally, what's your assessment of taking on me tonight?
Well, I mean, I've seen you play trivia. I've seen you debate. Like, I know you know your stuff. You have schooling in this realm. Like, you have taken film classes.
You're talking about that, yeah.
I've never taken a film class, so I don't have maybe the technical prowess you have. But these questions that we got, and since you know the same questions, I'm not going to spoil those questions. But with these questions, I think are a good mix of different types of questions. There's a lot of like extemporaneous type stuff that's going to happen tonight that I think I'm stronger at. Like if I just speak off the cuff and I'm just like basically going to be, pulling things out of thin air, which you will be too. It changes the nature of the debate. And I do think that is probably my strength. As you saw in the Ryan Johnson match, I showed up thoroughly unprepared and I felt I was entertaining. And I felt I put up good arguments having only seen Knives Out and Glass Onion,
Yeah, I mean, for what it's worth, you're like 4 messages to submit an answer for that Yoda answer is probably the funniest thing I've seen in a while. You can tell you're like forming the answer. You're like, yeah, that
Yoda.
Sure, let's do this.
I want to know more about Yoda. We deserve it. We're gonna get it eventually.
Oh, I'm sure we will. Disney, once The Mandalorian ends, they're going to need another reason to sell the remaining toys that they haven't sold yet. So that's when they're going to go back to Baby Yoda for real this time. And they're just going to sell the same toy because why wouldn't you?
Yeah, right.
It's cheaper than doing the Yaddle series everybody seems to want. So with that said, we're going to go ahead and jump into this matchup. Movie Battleground is a game that is a best of 5 rounds. It is the first to 3 points wins the match. Each round of debate is worth 1 point. If one of us picks up 3 points in a row, that will be a victory by knockout. And if at the end of 4 rounds is a 2-2 tie, we will go on to the blind round. In terms of our regular debate tonight, we have the questions. We've had the chance to prep. We will get 60 seconds to open, followed by 2 minutes to expand. 4 minutes of back and forth discussion and 60 seconds on a closing. Following that, I do have 3 judges backstage in Jake, Tato, Maria, and Zach. They will join us on screen, at which point they will decide who gets the point. With all that said, though, obviously I am here hosting, but that was not the original intent. So I do want to give credit to Mr. Kevin Poss, who unfortunately, anyone who's spoken to Kevin knows that he's had some recurrent family health issues that he has had to attain to, which is part of the reason he's not here tonight. But he did take the time to put in some genuinely good questions. So I appreciate you, sir. Thank you for your contribution. I also want to say thank you to Jake backstage. If we do need to go to the blind round, that was contributed by him. So he will join us for the presentation of that when ready. That said, though, John, ready to go.
Let's go.
All right. So let's hop into it with this first question. And I appreciate this. I always appreciate when somebody gives us a reason to go back to a classic director like this. We've actually had questions from this director before, but I appreciate both that I don't hope you don't mind me saying this. This is not a strength choice from either of us. This is just Kevin genuinely giving us a classic director's question. And B, he managed to pull a question that I hadn't actually asked yet, which happens more than you would think, because obviously none of the competitors who write when I play have the full question bank. So it's always nice when they come up with something I actually hadn't done yet. So the question for tonight is, what is the best Billy Wilder film released within the 1950s? So 1950 to 1959, we got 10 years of multiple classics if you look at the list to pick from. And genuinely, I think we have probably the 2 best choices. So let's duke this out. With that said, behind the scenes, I am the higher ranked competitor at, I think I'm like 6-3 or some shit like that. I don't fucking remember, but I am higher ranked. So I have the choice. So I chose to go first on 2 and 4, which means, John, you're going to go first on this question as well as question number 3.
Yep.
And we'll go ahead and bring in the timer. Of course, wish you the best of luck as well as myself, which feels a little conceited, but it is what it is. And your opening minute will start when ready.
Aaron set the stage pretty well. Billy Wilder, an absolutely classic director, possibly one of the best directors of all time. And the 1950s is packed full of a lot of good choices. So I picked the one that I believe is the most objectively has the most accolades. And I'm going to talk about Sunset Boulevard, which garnered 11 Oscar nominations, 3 Oscar wins, was nominated for Best Picture, nominated for Best Director, nominated in all 4 acting categories, and won Oscars for Best Original Screenplay, Best Art Direction, and Best Score. And if you listen to the score of this movie, it is absolutely magical. It absolutely transforms you into the field of where, it is the decay of the silent film. It's the rise of the talking pictures, the tragedy story of Norma Desmond, and the tragic story of Joe Guinness as well. And the set pieces in this movie are fantastic, from the opening shot with his body floating in the pool to the mansion of Norma Desmond, just the time and care put into the stages and scenery here. And then also the writing itself. Billy Wilder actually did contribute to writing the screenplay as well. And it is possibly one of the greatest screenplays we saw in the 1950s and all time.
And time. All right, so I went sort of the opposite direction when picking my answer. For what it's worth, my movie was acclaimed as well. I'll have that later. But I went with Some Like It Hot. I think that Sunset Boulevard is an excellent film, but I think it's definitely a film student's type of film. Whereas I think what succeeds about Some Like It Hot is Billy Wilder is a director. When you look at the films of his, multiple of them, but when you look at the films of his that have stood the test of time and are still actively brought up amongst film people today, a lot of them are his thrillers and his dramas. Some Like It Hot is just a straight up comedy. It is Billy Wilder doing the comedy that would have been equivocal in the 1950s. If this film was made today, it'd star Channing Tatum and Jonah Hill, and I think he succeeds so well at it. At something that's arguably a little out of his ballpark compared to some of the other movies that he's made. And I think that because of that, the film's level of success at something that he is not remembered for, I think that's what elevates it above the others. All right. John, back over to you, sir. 2 minutes to respond.
If you take what Aaron is saying, the strengths of Some Like It Hot are, I think we can look at Some Like It Hot in the entire pantheon of Billy Wilder's entire filmography, and we see that Some Like It Hot is he's working with IAL Diamond to write a comedy screenplay, and it looks like when you look through his filmography, it really is just gearing up for him and IAL Diamond to give us The Apartment, which is probably the greatest Billy Wilder film of all time. So I see Some Like It Hot as like a training film for The Apartment. Yes, he was out of his depth, and he was out of his depth as doing a comedy. He actually cast Marilyn Monroe, who was also out of her depth. You could tell she's out of her depth the entire time. And actually, if we're looking objectively at Some Like It Hot over the entire course of time, the film really ages extremely poorly. It is basically men in drag, which, I guess in 1959 was like the height of comedy. Nowadays, the Wayans brothers kind of killed that for the entirety with white chicks. We're never going to see this again. I believe if this movie, like I said on Letterboxd, if this movie was made in the 80s or 90s, it would be National Lampoon's Some Like It Hot. I'm not going to say it's lowbrow comedy because it is very clever. It is very well written. IAL Diamond is a genius. However, this does not stand the test of time. Jack Lemmon is supposed to be playing a 25-year-old girl. He has crow's feet the size of my hand. There's a lot of just inconsistencies in Some Like It Hot, and far be it for me to criticize a movie that is beloved, but I do believe that Sunset Boulevard as a drama, as one of his more powerful dramas, like that, Witness for the Prosecution, Stalag 17, it is Wilder's strength. He is much better at doing dramas. In Sunset Boulevard, the characters of Norma Desmond and Joe Gillis are much more fleshed out, much more like deep than the characters of Joe and Jerry and Sugarcane that we get in Some Like It Hot. For a movie that will stay with you, some of the scenes in Sunset Boulevard, like Joe Gillis floating in the pool, that stays with you. Some Like It Hot has a good one-liners. Obviously, you've got Joey Brown's "Nobody's Perfect" line, and that's really all it's really known for, just tiny moments. Sunset Boulevard is an entire experience.
All right. I think that the it doesn't age well argument doesn't hold any merit, because I think when you look at most films that come before a certain year, they don't age well into 2023. Sunset Boulevard, for example, Joe Gillis is the protagonist of that film in the way that it is presented. But I think through a 2023 lens, most people would view Norma Desmond as an actress who was cheated and fucked over by the industry, who has extreme mental health issues, and they wouldn't view her as the antagonist in the way that the film sort of does to an extent, at least through Joe Gillis's point of view at times. And I think he would actually be viewed as the antagonist in a lot of ways, because he is the one that is staying with a woman that he knows is in love with him, that he is not in love with for the most part, because it benefits him. He straight up says it in the film. He's also the one that, up until a certain point, is leading on another woman who is already engaged to be married to another man. And so I think with the age argument, that film doesn't age as perfectly either. What Some Like It Hot does, though, in terms of the comedy, I don't think it's just as simple as saying men in drag. I think White Chicks is as simple as men in drag. But with Some Like It Hot, I think there's something a little more complex there. For starters, I think that it does play, and it's one of the earliest films to play with the concept of gender roles. And I think specifically you have to look at I forget the character's name offhand, but the one that goes off with the rich guy. That's terrible. I can't remember the names. Because like he gets sucked up into the role almost too much, and it's not just as simple as like a man playing in drag. It's like he's sucked into the idea of almost falling in love with this guy. He has to actively be kind of shook out of this facade of you're a man. And I think it's also about, really, it's about the idea of being deceitful, right? Every character in this film is deceitful to a certain extent. It's not just these guys who are dressing up in drag. Nobody here is sort of saying exactly who they are. And I think that that plays into the comedy. As you said, I can't finish my point there, so I'll just call it. All right. So we'll go into the 4-minute open discussion. As always, the timer starts when the first competitor speaks. If you want to.
I'll just go on with the point you were making. Like, you're right. Joe and Jerry they're really the only really deceitful characters in the film. I think Osgood Fielding is straightforward. I think Sugar Cane is straightforward. Sugar Cane, like when she gives her whole like love history to Joe about like, oh, I fall in love with saxophone players. Like, she's being totally honest the entire film. Osgood Fielding is a rich guy. He gets whatever he wants. He's pretty honest the entire film. It's just Joe and Jerry, and they're dishonest because they're running for their lives. Like they would have died if they didn't lie. So it makes sense in context, but and so basically that's what I'm saying. That's the point I guess you were trying to make, is that there's only 2 dishonest characters in that movie, not everybody. It's their dishonesty that creates this comedy of errors, and I don't think it holds up. But go ahead.
So for starters, I think the issue with Sunset Boulevard, and this is something that I've argued about with on the show, is I think Sunset Boulevard is an example of when a strong performance overpowers the rest of the film. Gloria Swanson does give an incredible performance as Norma Desmond, and I think that character is incredibly well written. But I think that it kind of overshadows the rest of the film, and I think it patches up some of the errors that the rest of the film makes. For example, and maybe again this is an issue with branding and advertising, the film is advertised as a sort of mystery noir. That's how it's addressed when you look it up, except it's not really a mystery outside of the fact that shot of someone laying in a pool and the concept of starting from a murder has been used in other mystery sense. I mean, hell, even Archer has parodied that exact shot. Yeah. But and that makes it famous, of course, but that doesn't mean it's necessarily a good mystery, because anybody with 2 brain cells can figure out that Norma Desmond is the one that's going to kill him once you see how deranged she actually is.
I think mystery is only one of the subgenres, though. It's clearly a drama, and you're right. Like when you say it's a study of mental health, I would mean that's probably ahead of its time. I don't think Joe Guinness is presented as the protagonist of this movie. I think he's a Shakespearean hero. He's the tragic. Like all of his flaws are on display the entire time. He's the thing opens with them repossessing his car because he's irresponsible. He's like not lazy, but he's moved out. He's chasing the dream. He's like your stereotypical grinding Hollywood writer, and he's seedy. He's a seedy character, which means it is like a film noir. And I think you were 100% right. You're hitting the nail on the head why Sunset Boulevard is great. Norma Desmond is the real protagonist. She's a victim. Like, she was given the world, and then the rug was pulled out from under her. Even when she has that scene where Cecil B. DeMille, and he even looks at her like with pity. It's a double tragedy, but so much so Shakespearean for Joe Guinness, truly for Norma. I agree with everything you said. I don't think it was presented the way you're presenting it. I think it's presented the way you're actually talking about it, and that's why it does stand the test of time. It's a frozen in amber. It's a piece of film history presented to us, so we can appreciate how the silent pictures transitioned into the talking pictures and who the real victims were in Hollywood. Whereas Some Like It Hot is a time capsule of what was funny in 1959, but not funny now.
I think Some Like It Hot can absolutely still be viewed as funny now. I think, for example, I would argue that specifically when we're talking about like drag portrayals, there are some portrayals now that are more stereotypical than I think that film was in the 50s. And again, you have to account for the fact that both of these films, I would say, they were made in the 50s, right? There's elements that just naturally are not going to age well. But I think when you remove that element from it and you look at the film as it is, which Some Like It Hot is essentially a story of 2 different love stories, because both of them have their sort of weird, unique love stories that obviously are coming from Joe and Jerry, filled with the deception of the way their characters are lying throughout the film. I think that it makes it a much smarter comedy than something like White Chicks, to compare it to another.
They're rewarded for their deception. Like it's in the end, they're both rewarded. Whereas in Sunset Boulevard, we get the natural progression of deception leading to tragedy.
All right. Call time there. All right. You are back up first, John. Time starts when you begin speaking.
I got to appreciate this debate. I think Aaron and I are going to have a good time through this debate because, we're respecting each other. We're respecting each other's decisions. We're not talking over each other. But let's look at what's going on here. Sunset Boulevard is a piece of film history. It was one of the first films inducted into the Library of Congress. It's because it is showing us the progression of film in 1950. It's showing us the progression of what happened before 1950 and what's coming. Some Like It Hot is a film in 1959 about the 20s. The jokes were probably hysterical in 1959, but I think the jokes now, like you see them coming, they're dated. Jack Lemmon's miscast. There's no way he could pass a 25-year-old girl. They're not playing their instruments. Marilyn Monroe's performance, like she's clearly outacted by Tony Curtis. She's outacted by Jack Lemmon. It's not a bad film. Some Like It Hot definitely deserves the praise it got. However, like I said, objectively, Sunset Boulevard, 11 nominations, 3 wins. Sunset Boulevard, 6 nominations, 1 win, and the win was only for costume design. The screenplay that he wrote with I.A.L. Diamond didn't even hit. They won for The Apartment. This was a warm-up for The Apartment.
I don't think the argument that this was a warm-up for The Apartment holds weight, because again, I think you could put that on any filmmaker's career. You could argue that him doing dramas like Double Indemnity was a build-up to Sunset Boulevard. It's just a progression of the work that you do will obviously, if you're a good director, elevate what comes after it. I think what makes Sunset Boulevard, or sorry, not Sunset, I think what makes Some Like It Hot his best film from the 1950s is that when you compare it to the other films from the 1950s, it does stand out because it is so out of his water. And I think for a first attempt at it, I think he does an incredible job. As you said, it did still, for just a slapstick comedy in the 50s, it did pick up 6 nominations at the Academy Award. It did pick up 1 win. One of those was for screenplay, one of those was for direction, and one of those was for Jack Lemmon as best actor. Be it you say he's miscast, his performance is still incredible in the film, despite the role maybe not fitting him. I think that Sunset Boulevard gives a really great performance and a really great analysis on one character, but I think the rest of the story around it isn't as good as the rest of the movie that it's in. All right, and that is time. I'm going to go ahead and bring the judges in here. Go ahead and bring them in. I'm not going to bother dropping John out since I'd be on screen anyways. So Jake, I'm going to go to you first. Who gets your vote, and what was the main selling point?
Excuse me. Maher, he hit the prestige of all the awards, the noms, and the wins, and then also the shots, the characters, the writing. He pretty much just put together a clinic of why this was a special movie.
All right, and then Maria, down to you.
I'm going to give it to Aaron. At its heart, Some Like It Hot is a romance. I mean, it's definitely not what you were talking about. The story not around it was not worth it. The people were not very funny. The jokes still land. The jokes are still funny. Sunset Boulevard, Gloria Swanson takes over that movie to the detriment of every other character. So, in my opinion, I think that Aaron made a better argument about the merits of Some Like It Hot.
Okay, which means, Zach, I go over to you. Who gets your vote, and what was the main selling point?
I will say this is probably one of the closest debates I've ever watched in person. And it was back and forth the entire time. I went with John. I just felt like the big thing of like, oh, this is more of an experience more than like moments. And I just felt like he sold his movie and also gave some great counters. So that's why I went with John for that one.
Yeah, absolutely. Guys, thank you. I'll go ahead and put you in the back, and we will jump on to question number 2. I'm not even mad at it. Sunset Boulevard's a great film. Can't even be mad at that. So, dude, like, I said this to you obviously before, because like we did something most competitors don't do, which is we talked about the match before it ever happened. Yeah. And like,
it's good when you're debating the showrunner.
Yeah, he sent his answer in, and I went, fuck. And then I watched the movie again, and I went, fuck.
I think you had mentioned that you were debating witness for the prosecution, and I think like that would have been like you probably would have crushed me if you did that.
Probably.
Yeah.
Probably. But anyways, with that said, we'll go ahead and jump into the second question, which is, of course, the MCU is a thing that continues ever ticking, at least on the day that we're recording this. When it uploads, fuck if I know, I got to put the schedule together again. But on the day that we're recording this, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 is entering theaters. By the time this releases, there will probably be something else Marvel happening. I know that Secret Invasion is happening within the next 2 months. I know that Loki's supposed to happen this year. I don't know, maybe they'll move the Marvels up by 6 months again because they don't seem to have a consistent calendar anymore. Something Marvel is always happening. And something that is going to be happening in the near future is the reboot of the X-Men. The X-Men are going to be jumping over into the MCU because Disney owns the world now. And so the question that was presented to us is, what member of the X-Men that is not featured in their own film should have a feature film made? And I clarified with Kevin after the fact just to get an idea. This is essentially what character that never got their own spin-off film. So by the rules of the question, that basically just eliminates Deadpool, who's getting a movie anyways again, and Logan, of course, who's had his own trilogy. Everything else is fair game. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and bring the timer back in. I am up first on this one, so I will continue speaking once I have my thoughts together. Man, this never gets less weird. All All right. So my choice, when I was sitting and thinking of what X-Men to choose, I was trying to come up with one that people would be familiar with, but that hadn't had too much time to shine in the previous films. Because I think at this point, just throwing an X-Men at the wall won't work. I mean, Fox tried that themselves. They tried to take Gambit and make a movie, and they could never get it off the ground themselves. So I think you have to go with someone that people know. And so I went with Iceman. I think that he has had just enough screen time in the films that people are very aware of who Iceman is as a character. And that's not just the films. I mean, he was the co-star of a cartoon 30, 40 years ago. Like, people know who Iceman is, but he has never been a leading character in any of these films. And I think that there's so much to that character that is left to explore, especially because most of his screen time in the films was delegated to being Rogue's love interest, which isn't even a thing in the comics. That was just invented for those films. And so I think that there's an angle to this character that could be explored well through the MCU and its own solo film. All right, John, over to you for your opening minute.
Kind of when I think about how the MCU does things, like they're really big into taking it back as far as they can, like trying to get us the origin. So if we're going to introduce the X-Men, what better way to do an origin film for the X-Men than to give Charles Xavier his own movie? I mean, we've never, even when we had X-Men, like we come into it and, you know, the mansion's already there. He's already in the wheelchair. We kind of get some glimpses into how that happened, but that's really not the real story of the comics. I think presenting Charles Xavier's actual backstory, him being the wealthy son of Brian Xavier, who was a nuclear scientist, his father's tragic death, his mother remarrying Kurt Marco, Kane Marco being his abusive stepbrother, Kurt Marco being his abusive stepfather, his mother being driven to alcoholism, her dying, him being drafted to the Korean War with his stepbrother, Kane becoming Juggernaut, Charles fighting Shadow King in Egypt, and then wrapping it all up with it after the Korean War, coming back and meeting Magneto. There's so much to do here.
Okay, so for an Iceman film, the way that I envision this, or the way that I think it would be best envisioned in the MCU, is I think we take it back to a younger age. The MCU doesn't really cast teenagers, so we know it's going to be someone in their 20s. So let's say older high school or maybe early years in college. And I would do it as sort of I would do it in the vein of sort of like a teenage drama. So I would put in a set of characters. Let's say he just happens to naturally either he knows or connects with. I'm going to pull Pyro from the films because the two of them had a good connection in the films, and I think you can reuse that in a different way. And I'm going to pull Kitty Pryde because traditionally in the comics, that is who he's more so paired up with than Rogue as he was in the films. And I think that you can use Iceman as a character who begins to sort of develop his powers. And the thing that a lot of people don't know about Iceman is at full strength, he is one of the strongest characters in the Marvel universe, let alone amongst the X-Men. I mean, the dude could literally turn seasons on a dime and freeze the world over Elsa style if he wanted to. And so I think putting him at a younger age, early college, late high school, and having these powers begin to develop, and obviously you'd be frightened, you'd be confused. I think that that would create a good entrance point for the X-Men, because like we've seen in other films, you could bring him to the X-Mansion and sort of induct him into all of this, and I think that it would make for a good story. The element of the character that hasn't been explored that they think the MCU would want to touch is the fact that in the comics, Iceman has been a standout queer character, often being portrayed as gay, or if not gay, then for certainly bisexual. And I think that as he is a younger person who would be exploring his identity within his powers, I think you could very easily work in exploring his identity as a queer person. And I think that that is something that, if we're talking about the realism side of it, the MCU definitely wants to do, because they've said openly they like diversity, they like exploring these other stories. But I also think it would give people a different type of character to connect to, as we haven't had a character like that at the forefront of the MCU yet. All right, John, back over to you. 2 minutes.
I think really not that Iceman's a bad character, but the downfall of Iceman is, everything Aaron said about Iceman is true. He was He does come out as gay, hundreds of issues into the X-Men comics. And I think that was mostly because it was a failing of them making Wolfstar gay and nobody seemed to care. So they made a larger X-Man gay just to, appeal to that. And that's fine because when there's plenty of storylines in the Iceman solo comic that explore that, and they do it extremely well. However, when you go back to the entire history of Iceman, like he has no real singular nemesis. He has no real, his introduction is, he's the second X-Man. Like Cyclops is the first one, Iceman's the second one. That's basically it. And I guess you could make a story around that, but there isn't much to do with that. And like you have to stumble through all of this, all of his straight history in the comics before you even get to him being gay. I'm not really sure how we would introduce it because they took so long to introduce it in the Marvel canon. Whereas I feel Professor X comes gift wrapped with so many great stories and so many characters that were either introduced as comic relief or never introduced in the movies. The Juggernaut, like Vinnie Jones's Juggernaut and Ryan Reynolds' Juggernaut were joke Juggernauts. We've never gotten the real Juggernaut, like the actual unstoppable Juggernaut. And I think you can make him into a very well-rounded character when you see the abusive relationship that Kane Marco had with Charles Xavier when they were children, and Kane's father, Kurt Marco, abusing both kids, them witnessing Kurt dying in the explosion, dragging them both to safety, Kane resenting Charles, them both being drafted to the Korean War. It's a huge backstory, and that would only need to be the first half of the movie because we also get Shadow King, who's only been introduced in the Legion television series, and Shadow King is this huge villain like that, transcends time, transcends space, one of the most powerful evil mutants, actually the evil mutant that is the reason we have the X-Men. Charles Xavier fighting Shadow King in the 70s is what inspires him to find the X-Men. And it's actually the impetus for the schism between him and Magneto, which had spawned so many more films. I think we do Charles Xavier first, maybe Iceman second.
All right. So I'm going to jump in first for the 4-minute. So if we're talking about this, because we've talked about both the comics and the realism perspective of this, if we're talking about it from a realism perspective, we have seen so much of Xavier in a leading role that it would just be doing more of the same to put him in a leading role again. The vast amount of X-Men films, he is either a co-lead or he is a majorly supporting character. And even aside from that, X-Men First Class, X-Men Days of Future Past, Dark Phoenix, say what you will about the quality, and Logan have all deeply studied into the character's mental state, history, and actual character more than just him being the leader of the X-Men. Of course, he would be there as a supporting character in any film that you make, but making him the lead of a film, I just think we've done that already. It'd be retreading ground.
We make the same argument about Spider-Man. We've had Spider-Man's origin 3 times in the movies and countless times in cartoons and TV. But we do it
the
again.
Difference is The difference is, A, from a realism standard, Sony has nobody else to compete. Secondly, Spider-Man is singularly an iconic character of Marvel. He is like Batman. He will always be repeated, whereas Professor X is the equivalent of another one of the leaders of the Justice League. Like, you don't need to have films about them constantly.
But we've never had, with Superman, we always have Superman's origin. Every Batman movie shows his parents getting shot. Wonder Woman, we got her origin. Every X-Men movie starts with, here's the mansion, here's the jet.
And the reason why is I don't think that would actually make for a good superhero film. Everything that you're describing makes for a really interesting, like, Oscar-worthy character drama, but this is the MCU that we're talking about, and there's a certain formula, as has been openly discussed, that goes with these films. Your film sounds a little too overstuffed, considering everything that you've pitched is apparently just the first half, and then you bring in, is it Shadow King is the character's name?
Shadow King is the big bad, yeah.
Right. So to have everything with his origin and his stepfather and the abuse and his death and the Vietnam War and whatever else be the first half, and then you introduce an antagonist in the second half, that just sounds like a really overstuffed film.
Sounds like Captain America: The First Avenger, doesn't it? It's pretty much the whole first half of Captain America, like nothing happens, and they introduce the big bad halfway through. The origin story.
But Captain America doesn't dive into his whole life story like you're pitching. That's the difference.
But he's a teenager when it starts, and we're going to be having Charles Xavier start as a teenager. Nothing really happens when he's a child. His father dies when he's like a teenager. That's pretty much where it would start. You can gloss over everything else in the first 90 seconds, and then it starts with his father dying, the marriage to Marco, mother getting alcoholism thing. I think you can wrap up the whole like Juggernaut storyline in a half hour, and then have an hour and a half or more to play with, the fight with Shadow King.
So either way, the point still stands. I think that A, we've seen enough of Xavier in the films as a leading character, and B, I think that specifically the stuff you're pitching from the comics, I just don't know if it would interest the average viewer that makes up the bulk of the money that the MCU is taking in. Whereas with
look at the huge
Iceman,
response to him showing up, to Professor X showing up in Multiverse of Madness. They want
there was a huge response to Patrick Stewart showing up as very heavily hinted at the 90s version of that character. So that was fan service. That was not the specific character of Charles Xavier and his history appealing to people. But to move over to Iceman for a second, because I do want to get into this, I don't think the MCU has shown time and time again that they're not beholden to what happened specifically within the comics at any given point. They've adapted multiple stories and changed details left and right. Just because Iceman was straight in the comics for 15 years and then he came out doesn't mean you have to do that. It's actually more natural to start with him questioning himself at that younger age anyways, like the average person nowadays does.
Are you pitching Pyro as the villain?
I would say that you could pitch Pyro as somebody who is a friend either beforehand or once he realizes he's a mutant, and then yes, he could go bad. And I know that you're going to say they did that already, but that was a B story in a greater film.
Who's like every MCU film has an antagonist. Who is it?
I would say Pyro overall. Yes.
Okay.
All right, that is time. All right. So I would say that Pyro would make the most sense as a villain. I think that we've seen the two of them do have a connection, and we can do, and obviously, yes, they have done that in a film before, but it was such a small part of such a big film that I think you could give that story more time. At the end of the day, I think Iceman is a character we know less about in terms of his actual character and his personality. I think he has a more interesting background for a modern audience. Yours, like if you took Xavier's story and put it in a biopic, that's a really interesting story. I don't think comic fans who are seeing these films care about telling that type of story. Whereas I think Iceman can connect to a modern audience as a hero. I think he's someone we don't know a lot about. I think that in a practicality reasoning, he can introduce the X-Men through a very interesting prism. And I think it can allow us to explore stories we've never seen before, both in terms of power set, in terms of character, in terms of dealing with an LGBTQ plus character and introducing them to a newer audience. I think that there's just a lot more opportunity with Iceman than there is with Professor X. All right, and your final minute, sir.
I think the strength of the Professor X movie is it fits in with the MCU formula of how we introduce teams. We're not going to start with Iceman. Iceman is maybe, if you go all the way back to X-Men #1, he's maybe the third most interesting X-Man behind Cyclops and Jean Grey, right? So to actually manufacture a universe, and in the core line of Aaron's story, it's Iceman versus Pyro, which Aaron said we might have seen Professor X before. We've actually seen Iceman versus Pyro. It's called X-Men. So we're basically getting a rehashing of X-Men, but they're teenagers and Iceman is struggling with his sexuality. Okay, maybe, but like that's something we would introduce after we get this really great untapped storyline. We have never seen a serious Juggernaut, like the Juggernaut that fought Thor. We've never seen that guy. We've never seen the Shadow King outside of Legion, which was a great show, but it's kind of hard to get into. Shadow King as an astral plane projecting telepathic big bad in this movie is something else. Yes. We've seen like magical, and we've never seen like the telepaths fighting each other. I think Professor X leading us into more X-Men films is where we start.
And time. All right. Go ahead and bring the judges in. This time around, we will start with Maria. So who gets your vote, and what was the main selling point?
It's really hard. You both had really good points. The thing I have to remember at the end of the day is that Xavier has had a lot of leads, a lot of playtime. I don't know anything about Iceman. He sounds intriguing. I don't know anything about his character or I didn't read the comics. I'm going to go with Aaron because I think Iceman is a better pick.
Okay. Zach, down to you. Who gets your vote, and what was the main selling point?
I'm also going with Aaron more because I feel like you sold the movie more, but also you brought up the points of that the Xavier one sounds very overstuffed, and also we've seen Xavier as the lead or co-lead before. So for that, I went with Aaron.
All right, judges, thank you guys. I'm going to go ahead and sit you in the back, and we will go ahead and go into question number 3. Question number 3, it's actually incredibly ironic, which this will make more sense once we give our answers. we have two answers, both of which are to some extent very vibrant, and the question is centered around something which is very, very dead. I'm sure that makes sense to John. So this is essentially a revival. We're pitching the revival of something to an extent. So the question is, what other iconic horror movie villain, aside from Freddy, should Jason from Friday the 13th feature in a new film with? So if we're pitching, obviously I should state, because I know for a fact it's not my pitch, it does not have to literally be Jason versus blank. We can pitch whatever the hell we want. I know John is the horror guy. I'm sure you have something up your sleeve that I will fail to debate against. But that's a horrible thing to say right before we start. This is an interesting one for sure. So again, the question is, what other iconic horror movie villain besides Freddy should Jason from Friday the 13th feature in a new film with? John, you are back up first this time, sir. So you have 1 minute on the clock. Time starts when you begin speaking.
Horror is such a vast world, and I think a lot of the pitfalls of horror is people don't protect the canon. So what I'm saying is we need to protect canon in horror. And Friday the 13th has had many pitfalls. Nightmare on Elm Street, tons of pitfalls. However, we can preserve it. And to preserve it, the only real horror icons matchup that would fit in here that we have not seen is if we introduced Michael Myers into the Friday the 13th universe. And how do we protect canon by doing that? Well, we know if we have classic Michael Myers under the Curse of Thorn, who is forced to stalk and kill his living family members, and Jason Voorhees in canon, living at Camp Crystal Lake. Imagine if Laurie Strode knew, if they're living in the same universe, that there's an unstoppable killing machine at Crystal Lake. Wouldn't it make sense to lure Michael Myers to Crystal Lake to put Jason in the path of the unstoppable killing machine trying to kill her? That would protect both canons. It makes sense if they both exist within the same universe, that when they are both alive and active, to put them in the paths and have these two unstoppable monsters fighting each other.
And time. All right. So and this is not just me making some jest for this round, I've made it very clear, if anyone's ever spoken to me, I'm not that much of a horror guy. That's probably why I've had to debate so many horror questions. But I did not think of anything like the canon approach, because I've not seen all the films in the Friday the 13th franchise. I know little bits and pieces about the ones I haven't seen, but not enough to keep a canon. So I'm sort of going for something that's a total reboot type thing, at least for Jason. And my pitch is Ghostface. And what I mean by that, because obviously Ghostface is not a singular villain. There's no one character that portrays the concept of Ghostface. Is I would tie Jason into a Scream film. And I think that the conflict that's presented here is obviously, like I said, it's not a, blank versus blank concept, but I think that Scream is already a film in which you are trying to evade a slashing killer, and you're also trying to figure out the mystery behind it. And I do think Friday the 13th lends itself to that. All right. John, you are back up. 2 minutes on the clock when ready.
I think my biggest problem with Aaron's pick is the canon argument. Scream, as Scream exists as a horror fan, Scream exists solely as an island, as a mirror that you hold up to the rest of the horror universe. To cross over Scream or Ghostface or any intellectual property from Scream into any other universe violates the rules of the Scream universe. In fact, if you have seen Scream, I think we've all seen Scream, the opening scene of Scream with Casey Becker opens with her failing to answer a trivia question about Friday the 13th. So in the universe that Scream has created, Friday the 13th is a fictional entity in that universe. Everything that is a horror movie is a fictional entity in the Scream universe. Therefore, crossing over anything that is any kind of supernatural prowess or any kind of zombies, werewolves, everything into the Scream universe breaks the Scream universe, violates the canon of the Scream universe, and invalidates the value of Scream overall in the horror community. Scream is meant to be a critique of horror, a study of horror, a love letter to horror. To introduce a movie mentioned in the movie into the movie invalidates the entire franchise. We cannot do that to Scream. Wes Craven would not only roll over in his grave, he would come out of his grave and find Aaron for putting this out into the universe. I'm not saying I wouldn't love to see Jason beat the crap out of a kid in a Halloween costume, because it wouldn't be that much of a fight. But, whatever. If in a future Friday the 13th movie somebody just happens to be wearing a Father Death costume, great. But that's the only crossover you're going to see. You cannot cross over the Scream universe and the Friday the 13th. However, Michael Myers and Friday the 13th are similar, and I've given you the path. Laurie Strode goes to Crystal Lake. Michael Myers follows. And then we have all the principals, maybe the police force. There's unlucky hikers, unlucky campers. You have your typical Friday the 13th movie, but then there's two killers that just happen to cross paths. And I hope and pray the fight is better than the fight in Freddy versus Jason, because we don't need more Muay garbage. Just two hosses slugging it out. Give me that.
I'll agree with you on that last point. All right. So my issue with your pick, and I guess it's part of the reason why I went for something so out there, is your two guys are kind of exactly the same. They're both these like non-speaking meatheads that just go around killing people. What made Freddy versus Jason at least work in concept to some extent, because I admittedly I don't love that movie, but what made it work in concept is that Jason is this sort of silent, just lughead that goes around and kills people, and Freddy is loaded with personality. They're two different types of killers. They have two different approaches to how they kill. One is very straight up, the other messes with your dreams. They are opposites attracting to each other that can create a very unique type of chaos. Whereas bringing Michael to Camp Crystal Lake and just having these two face off against each other, I don't know, Jason's got a machete and Michael's got a different type of big knife. Like it feels very stale. I mean, a lot of people complained about the just the lack of oomph in the fight at the end of Halloween Ends, and I feel like pitting these two against each other creates a sort of weird similar thing, because there's no dynamicism between either of these guys. They're just both big dudes that stab each other. I feel like we're not going to get something that's very inventive, and I feel like it's going to just become a run-of-the-mill film that fits into either of these franchises. Now, for what it's worth, I'm totally game for it. If my pick breaking the lore that heavily is what kills me with the judges, I'll totally accept it. But at the very least, I think you can make a more unique film with this concept. My idea in terms of like a light pitch for it is that, you know, we've already seen with Scream 6, and Scream 6 wasn't the first one, but we've seen that the writers are more willing to get away from Woodsboro in these films. So let's imagine that these characters go to somewhere like Camp Crystal Lake. Maybe it's even named Camp Crystal Lake. We've already seen that the Scream franchise itself is incredibly self-referential. We know that Friday the 13th exists in it. So what if Jason just happened to actually be real? That's like the one that is actually real. You could get... Stop myself. All right, we're going to go into the 4-minute open discussion. Timer starts when the first person speaks.
Yeah, I think just aside from like the canon breaking, which I've already beaten to death, it's more that like in Scream, in all the Scream movies, it's confined to reality. Like, sure, in Scream 3, they make Roman look like he's unstoppable, but it's because it's revealed he's wearing a bulletproof vest. Or it looks like, you know, they move really fast, but it's revealed there's more than one killer. And honestly, your critique about Jason and Michael not talking, Ghostface doesn't talk until he or she takes the mask off anyway. So
the only reason I jump in is because my critique is not that they don't talk. My critique is that they're basically the same character. They are both 6'7", non-speaking lugheads that go around and stab people. If it weren't for the fact that they literally have different masks, they'd be the same character.
I mean, all these kaiju movies are just this giant monster versus this giant monster. This is a lizard. This is a bumblebee. This is a lizard.
I don't disagree with you.
Yeah, I mean, and those are widely successful.
Sorry, Alan.
We're breaking on these franchises. People love Jason. People love Michael Myers. Yes, they are both silent killers. Yes, they both use bladed weapons. And we're not it's not going to just be like 90 minutes of just following these two guys around. We're going to have Laurie Strode. We're going to have a bunch of interesting side characters of interest. You'll always have your dumb.
That's gone so well in the last couple of films.
I mean, we can always recast. It doesn't need to be Jamie Lee Curtis again. You know, we're just keeping within the universe with the characters. You're always going to have your dumb shit cops. You're always going to have like your teenagers, and one or two of them are going to be like standout characters, and we'll build around them. And they can always have commentary. Even in Freddy versus Jason, you still had Kelly Rowlands saying wacky stuff. You had Monica Keena saying wacky stuff. You had John Ritter's kid saying wacky stuff. We're not building around these guys. They're just the killers, and people are just there for the fight. As long as that choreography and that fight is good, you're gonna put asses in seats. The Ghostface thing.
I think with the idea, I think the idea of mixing Scream and Friday the 13th, I think you could get a film where you're there for more than just the fight. For example, if you don't reboot totally, and let's say you stick with this as it's some kind of sequel to Scream 6, people are connecting with the characters from that film, Melissa Barrera, Jenna Ortega, Mason Gooding, more than they've connected with any character in this franchise outside of Sidney and David Arquette, because even Courtney Cox, I don't know if people are wholly on board with in every single film. People are connecting with these characters. So off the bat, you already have a stronger foundation. In Halloween, I think it's basically just Laurie Strode. I mean, they tried with, is it Corey Cunningham? Is that his name? They tried in Halloween Kills to bring in another character that you could relate to and connect to. And people just, for whatever reason, they didn't buy into it.
I think another criticism of the Scream franchise is, of course, you're going to need canon characters. You need Gail or Sidney or Chad or Mindy or Tara or Sam.
Yes,
none of those 6 characters are stupid enough to go to Camp Crystal Lake if it really existed. These are horror savvy people. So if you put a real Camp Crystal Lake into the Scream universe, no way Mindy goes there. No way Chad goes there. No way Tara goes there. No way Sam goes there. None of them would wind up there. You'd basically, the only thing you could bring there is literally the ghost face costume and put it on some random, have some killing spree, and then your only connection to Scream is a prop. It's not, it's absolutely outside of canon.
I think, first off, I think if Camp Crystal Lake did exist, I think you could get those characters there no matter how savvy they are. If only because I don't think any of them would genuinely believe that Jason exists. You know what I mean? In Scream 6, we saw a hall of canon, for lack of a better term, of just all these different props and pieces that are attributed to the previous films. I mean, it's literally the killer's calling card in the 6th film that spoilers, I guess, that they leave the masks from the different films at the scenes of the crime, right? I think Camp Crystal Lake could exist as this replica of the camp from the films, and then the characters go there because they think it'll be cool to go there, and they show up and it turns out Jason's real. The other thing that I think makes it more interesting with Jason and crossing those two over is because you could obviously bring in a Ghostface killer. That's the concept of the question. You bring in a Ghostface killer, but Jason has a backstory to him that the character I'll just finish it in 1 minute. Fuck it. I believe in myself very hard right now. John, go ahead, sir. You got 1 minute on the clock when ready.
When I hear Aaron's idea, I'd still watch that movie. I'd watch every stupid movie. But that's if you want to talk about Fonzie jumping the goddamn motorcycle over the shark, bringing an undead killer into the Scream universe is jumping 20. It's jumping 30 sharks. No character. Mindy Meeks Martin would not be caught dead at Camp Crystal Lake. Literally, she wouldn't be caught alive at Camp Crystal Lake. And also, it would have to build up some kind of conflict where the ghost face killer is killing people and Jason happens to be there. A conflict between some kid in a costume and Jason is like a no contest, whereas a fight between Michael Myers and Jason Voorhees is like a UFC main event. It's like a WrestleMania main event. That's what you're selling. That's what they sold Freddy versus Jason on, Godzilla versus Mothra, that Japanese movie with Sadako versus Kayako. It's all about the fight, right? That's going to be your multi-million idea. It's the fight. There's going to be victims laying in the aftermath, but it's the fight is all about. Don't ruin Scream. It has to be an island. That's why it's there.
All right, first off, a crossover of franchises of any kind is already a jumping of the shark. So if we're going to jump the shark, let's jump the shark. Secondly, Mindy is busy doing a show called Yellow Jackets. It's very successful. So if she wants to not come to New York because she's busy filming something else or come to Camp Crystal Lake, that's totally cool. She can stay in New York. But here's the basis of my pitch is more so I think that these crossover films, as we've seen, need to be more than just a duel because Freddy vs. Jason is cool, but it's not great. Alien vs. Predator is kind of cool, but it's not great. And the sequel's even fucking worse. I think if you bring the lore of Jason, the character of Jason, you cross him over into Scream, sure, maybe it breaks all the conventions of the franchise. Maybe the horror diehards hate me for it. But I think what you get is, especially with the talent involved with the franchise at this moment, is you get a film that draws you into Jason based on the characters, which I don't think they've had since Tommy Jarvis existed. I think that you have characters that are investigators. They would explore the lore of Jason, and it would bring a new element to this franchise. And that is time.
Respect for invoking Tommy Jarvis. That's right.
What'd you say?
I said respect for invoking Tommy Jarvis. That's good. Do that.
I was like I said, I know the details. And that's it. I can tell you he's in 4. I can't tell you how many more he's in. So
5 and 6, and that's it.
5 and 6. Okay, so it's like a trilogy basically.
Yeah.
All right, so we'll bring the judges in. Zach, you are up first this time around, so I'll go to you. Who gets your vote, and what was the main selling point?
I actually went with you, Aaron, because I felt like you actually sold yours more and made me more invested in that movie. And also the counter of that basically Michael Myers and Jason Voorhees are kind of the same character and that really stood out to me. So for that, I'm going with you, Aaron.
Okay. Jake, down to you. Who gets your vote?
I got Calamity John on this one. He was able to throw in a strong enough pitch for his movie while also just completely decimating the idea of Scream and Jason belonging in the same sentence together.
All right, which means Maria, we'll go over to you. Who gets your vote, and what was the main selling point?
The main selling point was the fact that you're right; those two characters are the same character that John was defending. Giving you my point. I thought you did a really good job of giving a new take on how to be. So.
Okay. All right. I'll go ahead and put you guys in the back, and we'll go ahead and move on to question number 4. And this is a hell of a question. I feel like this is one of those, like, this is a defining debate type question. You know what I mean? Like these are questions that real people debate, and not just, guys in a movie debate league. With that said, the question is, who is the best director of the 2000s? And again, as I always preface for people, that is 2000, 2009. Those are the 10 years we're working within. Who is the best director of said decade? With that said, I am up first this time around, so I will start in just a second. All right, so when it comes to the 2000s, I think as time continues to go forward and we think back on the decade, and I should state, this is not the wording of the question. It is just who is the best director of the 2000s is the exact wording. But the reason I stress that is because I think when you're picking the best director, I think you're also picking someone who sort of defines the decade. I think you're picking somebody who you think of when you think of 2000s films. And I think that is going to be Christopher Nolan. Obviously, he debuted in 1998 with Following, but his 5 films over the course of the 2000s in Memento, Insomnia, Batman Begins, The Prestige, and then The Dark Knight, I think each in their own way elevated his esteem amongst film audiences. I think from a quality perspective, they showed different elements that he could handle, and it all culminated in The Dark Knight, which is one of the highest grossing films of all time. It's one of the biggest blockbusters of all time. It's the film that made people take comic book films seriously. It impacted the Oscar rules going forward. It had a wave effect over Hollywood. All right, John, over to you. 1 minute on the clock.
When I think of this question, I'm a little more objective than Aaron. I'm trying to think, like, who is the best director of the 2000s? Who have we said is the best director of the 2000s? So the guy I'm talking about, he had 3 pictures nominated for Best Picture. He was nominated for Best Director 3 times. He won each one of those, and he's responsible for a total of 9 acting nominations under his direction with 4 wins. And I'm talking about Clint Eastwood. Clint Eastwood gave us Mystic River. He gave us $1 Million Baby. He gave us the World War II duality of Flags of Our Fathers and Letters from Iwo Jima. And then we got Gran Torino, and we got Invictus, and some other movies in there too, which also won accolades as well. Even Space Cowboys was nominated for an Oscar. The only real stinkers in there is probably Bloodwork and Gran Torino, I guess, even though Gran Torino is important in the fact that it shed light on Cambodian actors and the crisis of the Hmong. I think Clint Eastwood is a man who has built up a career, and in the 2000s, we trusted him. We trusted him, this conservative man, to tell the story of the Japanese in World War II, to tell Nelson Mandela's story. We trust Clint Eastwood. He's the best director of the 2000s.
And time. All right, so I will concede that point to you. In terms of if we're talking about Oscar caliber, that type of success, Clint Eastwood definitely had more success than Christopher Nolan. It's also worth noting that by the time he hit the 2000s, Eastwood was an established talent, whereas Christopher Nolan was not. And oftentimes when people analyze films and they look back at the Oscars from the 2000s, people are often shocked that his films did not get more love at the Oscars. Obviously, Memento and The Dark Knight are the 2 that stand out the most, as they should have gotten more love. But I've also seen a lot of discussion. The performances in Insomnia are incredible, and they got, especially Robin Williams, and they got no love from the Academy. A lot of people would also vouch for The Prestige. I think with Nolan, the reason why he is the defining director of the 2000s is, first off, people are already being influenced by his work. I think we've seen with the likes of Denis Villeneuve, who obviously has influences from other places, but modern up-and-coming blockbuster directors now are already taking influence from Christopher Nolan that quickly. I also think, again, when you look at those 5 films, Memento showed his prowess as a screenwriter and how he could take an out-of-place story similar to Pulp Fiction and make it work in a way that few directors can. Insomnia showed his ability to direct talent. Batman Begins showed his ability to handle a blockbuster and a major IP. Again, he revitalized Batman in the way that nobody else could, because there are multiple failed attempts over the course of the early 2000s to get that character rebooted that never worked out. I think that The Prestige showed that he could pull off the quote-unquote twist ending, and I think that he could make a great sci-fi film to an extent, because it is sort of a sci-fi film. And again, The Dark Knight is sort of the pinnacle of all that. The performances, the screenplay, the blockbuster element, it has everything that you want in it. Clint Eastwood did have some great films during the 2000s. And again, those 3 Best Picture nominees, Mystic River, $1 Million Baby, and Letters from Iwo Jima, are excellent. But the reason I don't think Clint Eastwood is the best director of the 2000s is because he does have 9 films, and multiple of those films are not talked about today. Space Cowboy, nobody thinks about. Bloodwork isn't very good. Changeling, honestly, isn't very good. Gran Torino is not looked fondly upon. I just think he's too inconsistent to be called the best. All right, and that is time for me. If the video would pause.
I'm not talking.
Why won't it pause? That was so weird. Why wouldn't it pause? Anyways, John, you'll get those 8 seconds back. With that said, your timer starts when you begin speaking.
Yeah, Christopher Nolan did 5 movies. Clint Eastwood did 9 movies. It's understandable that within those, you're going to have 1 or 2 that aren't as good as them. None of the movies that Clint Eastwood did in the 2000s are bad. And I would also argue that Christopher Nolan was handed the Batman franchise, which had success before, had success in the 60s. Tim Burton had success in the late 80s, early 90s with it. He was handed a property that was already popular. And then with Memento, not really an extremely successful movie, but a great movie, and his writing was excellent. But we talk about all across all those movies, 13 nominations for Christopher Nolan, only a total of 2 wins. Clint Eastwood has 25 nominations, 7 wins. So even their percentages, Clint Eastwood has better percentages across those movies. Even if there are, what you say, bad movies in there, not really. Only 2 of them earned no Oscar nominations. I guess the worst movie out of all of those, would be Bloodwork, and even that is not rotten necessarily on Rotten Tomatoes. It's just not as good as these great movies. If you go back and you watch Mystic River, if you watch the performances he got out of Sean Penn, the performance he got out of Tim Robbins, you watch $1 Million Baby, his performance. He's acting in these movies he's directing. He's scoring these movies he's directing. This man, throughout his career, starting in the late 60s, early 70s, up to the 2000s, this 2000s is the culmination of all of the talent, all of the experience he garnered, directing all those movies in the 70s and the 80s, getting through his first Oscar win for Unforgiven in the 90s, and then bringing it hard in the 2000s, giving us great performances. Hilary Swank's performance in $1 Million Baby, Ken Watanabe's performance in Letters from Iwo Jima, which was snubbed. Angelina Jolie's performance in The Changeling was nominated for an Oscar. You're saying the movie wasn't very good. Every movie he's done has garnered at least some kind of accolade from the Academy. Even Gran Torino, which people say wasn't great and was controversial, no other movie shone a light on the struggles of Cambodian Americans. Clint Eastwood, this conservative man who debated an empty chair with President Obama, this guy who's clearly a conservative man, gladly, truthfully, honestly, powerfully takes on things he should be politically opposed to. The honesty and the truth that Clint Eastwood brings, where he puts his art over himself, makes him the best director of the 2000s.
All right, and that is time. I'm going to jump back in first off and say Bloodwork is rotten on Rotten Tomatoes. I believe it's about a 52%, which is rotten. It's also rotten in the audience score. But if you want to talk numbers, Academy accolades are a lot, sure. But I think we're comparing a rookie versus an industry vet. And Eastwood is not just an industry vet as a director. He's a beloved figure in the industry, both as an actor, from a producer standpoint, from a director standpoint. And I think we can all acknowledge that the Oscars are inclined to lean towards those they know and love. And it's harder for newer people to get in. If you want to talk about numbers, Eastwood, I went on Rotten Tomatoes, which of course is not everything, but it is a good aggregate of what people think about films. Eastwood's critic average over the 9 films he made in the 2000s is a 76.77. His audience average is a 74.88. Nolan has an 87.8 critic average and a 90.2 audience average.
Over less films,
Eastwood,
and over less films, and The Dark Knight is one of them. So that's not really a fair comparison. And
but,
also, if what you're saying about the Academy,
what does that mean, though?
Everything Everywhere All at Once would have won nothing. Everything Everywhere All at Once should have won 0 Oscars by your opinion.
I just want to call out what he just said there. His exact wording was, and The Dark Knight is one of them. Eastwood had multiple Oscar successes over the course of the 2000s, but he has not one film in the 2000s where you go, but it's that. Whereas Nolan has The Dark Knight, and that came in the 2000s.
Yeah, 1 out of 5. There's more consistency across Eastwood's movies in the 2000s. He was trusted with telling great stories. He was trusted with telling both sides of the Battle of Iwo Jima. He was trusted about talking about Nelson Mandela's presidency in South Africa. He was trusted about telling the plight of Cambodian immigrants in Gran Torino. He gets honest stories. Christopher Nolan gets a lot of things that people are just into, like Batman, The Prestige. There are supernatural things in all these movies. Clint Eastwood's telling real stories, real dramas, real performances.
Honest question, and I agree with you. The topics of Eastwood's films are very interesting topics. I don't think he always delivers on the actual full film, but the topics are interesting. I think Invictus could have been done better by another director. I think he makes a serviceable film, and I think he gets good performances out of Freeman and Damon, but I think a better director could have done that movie stronger. So let me ask you, because you're saying Nolan just gets things handed to him, right? First off, all of his screenplays are movies that he writes by himself. Memento, which is arguably his most creative film, is an original concept. And you said Batman was handed to him. He had to, first off, make 3 movies, all of which were successful, to earn Batman. And then Batman was a poisoned fruit. They were coming off of Batman and Robin. They were coming off of Steel. They were coming off of Catwoman the year before. DC as a whole was a poisoned fruit. Nobody thought Batman Begins was going to be.
There was a huge amount of time between Batman and Robin and Batman Begins. People had time to forget. And you're right. You do hand it over to a fresh young director. And he did a great job. No one's saying he didn't do a great job, but they're comic book movies. Even bad comic book movies have a relative level of success. Look at like Captain Marvel or Eternals. Like people still
look at X-Men Dark Phoenix.
Yeah,
that movie killed a franchise, and it's also horrible. And it was done by a rookie director, which, to be fair, that was Kinberg's first film, and this was Nolan's 4th film, but still, rookies, as you're saying. I think it's a testament to Nolan that he was such a rookie and that he was making films that were this consistently good. Eastwood's Oscar success comes because he is a veteran of the industry working with veterans of the industry who are all very good and serviceable at their job.
Right. So he's built up this thing so that he is that good in the 2000s. Nolan's a rookie in the 2000s still, pretty much.
And he's better.
We're talking about an established person. We're talking about Muhammad Ali. And then we have this rookie up and coming. I'm not saying Christopher Nolan's a bad director. No one's saying he's a bad director. I love all this. And it's a shame you can't include Inception in your film because it's 1 year too late. But like Eastwood was already up here. You have Nolan on the rise. You have Eastwood up here killing it already. That's why he's the best director of the 2000s. He's already there. We're not talking about the 70s, the 80s, and 90s where he's only putting a good few films out here and there. He has several good films and a ton of Oscar cred in the 2000s.
Clint Eastwood is more prolific in the 2000s than Nolan is, but I think by being more prolific, it opened him up to making worse films. Even if you don't want to say he made a bad film, Bloodwork, Changeling, I'd even put Gran Torino in there, and I think there's an argument for Invictus and definitely Space Cowboys. They're all worse than the worst Nolan film in the 2000s. Sure, his highs garnered him Oscar success. He did win Best Picture and Best Director for $1 Million Baby. I'll give you that. But at the end of the day, Nolan's films, all 5 collectively, are going to be remembered more than all of Eastwood's. I'd say any one of Nolan's films are going to be remembered more in the future than all of Eastwood's projects together. I think Christopher Nolan had a more impressive decade. I think his films maybe didn't get the Oscar success, but the fact that they have enough public love that people look back on them and say they should have achieved more Oscar success says more than actually getting the nominations and the wins in that time. Eastwood is a legendary director, but not for this decade specifically. Nolan owned the 2000s. All right, and then you have your final minutes, sir, when ready.
I would say the question is not like which director do you look back on most fondly in the 2000s? Who is the best director of the 2000s? If you look critically, we're talking about Eastwood, 25 nominations across 9 films. Nolan, 13 nominations across 5 films. Eastwood's numbers are better. 3 best director noms, 1 win. Nolan, none. Only nomination personally was for screenwriting, and it was a brilliant screenplay. Eastwood is directing his films. He is acting in some of them. He is scoring some of them. The man is a jack of all trades, and he honed his craft through the 70s. He honed it through the 80s. He honed it through the 90s, won an Oscar for Unforgiven, and comes barreling into the 2000s, gives us Mystic River, which I dare you to say is a bad film, gives you $1 Million Baby, which I dare you to say is a bad film, Letters from Iwo Jima, Flags of Our Fathers, and Invictus are all fantastic films with deep subject matter, things that like they move you as audiences. Sure, you're going to go to Dark Knight and have a great time. Batman Begins, you have a great time. Memento is pretty cool. None of those movies hit you. Eastwood's films hit you. He is a powerful filmmaker that can invoke feelings in the viewers.
And time. All right, we'll go ahead and bring the judges in. We'll go to Jake first, sir. Who gets your vote, and what was the main selling point?
I gotta go with Aaron on this one. Just the 5 having more consistency than his 9. The overall films, the 87 to the 76, and that the could have gotten more Oscar noms, and that the Oscars kind of have that like Tarantino, Jesus Christ, Clint Eastwood was already more beloved, so that's why he got some. Yeah, it's same dude. Aaron, you get the point.
Okay, Maria, down to you.
I have to go for Aaron. I thought he did a very good job of defending Clint Eastwood and the movies that he's made. I think he kind of stuck on a few things that he kind of blew you out of the water with. I hate to say that, but I think he did a good job, and I think he convinced. Yeah, he was very convincing.
All right, judges, thank you guys so much. I'm gonna go ahead and put you guys behind the scenes, and I'm not gonna do an Andrew winner because it just feels weird to do it for myself. I did it once before.
Do it.
All right, fine. And your winner by a final score of 3-1, Aaron Connole. Still weird. All right, so I'm not going to bother interviewing myself. I'm just going to go straight to you because I think I can get my opinions out while talking to you. John, first off, I always say I don't usually air things like this behind the scenes, but I do want to say first off, thank you for bearing with me. As a lot of you guys know, because it'll be made public before this uploads, I've had a fucking horrible couple of weeks. And this match has kind of been in the background during all of that. And I've had to, for different reasons, cancel 2 different times. So I just want to say, first off, from a production standpoint, thank you for always being just incredible with that. I appreciate you. How are you feeling after the match?
I feel fine. You really can't win them all. As you know, I think my arguments were strong, but sometimes you just you can't count on everything. You can. What did Abraham Lincoln say? You can please some people all the time and all people some of the time, but not all people all the time. So that is just today is the best example of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I genuinely shocked I won that horror question because that's one of the ones like I speak about like from a competitor's perspective because I don't feel the need to keep secrets from how I think about things. Like I try and think of what the person's argument is, and I think in my own head I just got so stuck on the like I can't even comprehend like how you make that. I think you actually did have an intriguing pitch, especially because you had a semblance of a story there. But obviously, yeah, there was definitely some good back and forth debates. I have to say thank you for making me watch Sunset Boulevard again. Thank you for making me watch some of those Eastwood films in the 2000s I hadn't seen, except for Bloodwork. I genuinely didn't like that one. But
that's honestly the worst one. I mean, we know.
It is. No, very easily. Changeling was boring, but I'm not going to say it's bad. It was boring to me, but I'm not going to say it's bad. So obviously right now your record, you are 4-2 with 1 knockout. You're going to get, obviously, when you want it, you're going to get a match in the near future once again. And at this point, you are still in that secure spot. But with another win, you would definitely be a shoo-in for the tournament going into the end of the season. So what are your thoughts on that kind of going forward? Because obviously the tournament last year was where you sort of got your step up in competition going against Chris and then obviously Will.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just going to take it as it comes. Like I'm doing my best. I'm preparing these questions pretty well. Like I think my arguments are solid. Not even sour graping it. Like I said, you are a student of the game. You know your stuff. It's just wasn't my day today, I suppose. I'll probably have other opinions offline, but that's the way it is.
I want to hear those opinions offline.
You'll get them.
Oh, for sure. No. I love that part of it. Yeah, absolutely, man. So it's always great to have you. I do genuinely, as much shit as I gave you for like the Ryan Johnson thing, you are a natural enough speaker that you can show up to just about anything and put in a shift. And definitely, I don't think in my own head, I don't know if I won that in 3 questions, but I did, or 4 questions, I guess. I don't know if I won that. Certainly those last 2, I was kind of sweating, wondering where it would go. So I appreciate you for giving me a game. And of course, I look forward to having you back in the near future. And I mean, hey, look, I give people title contentions because their record makes sense and they're at that point in the table, and I have to in order to rotate, where people go. But
I'll get there.
We've seen, you know what I mean? Somebody like Chad, who wanted it, got it earlier in his career and it didn't work out for him totally. Someone like Austin got it later in his career than he would have wanted it, and I think it made him put in a much better shift. So I certainly don't think it's a bad thing that you're not quite there yet. Here's an interesting question because you didn't unfortunately win tonight. The person who will take the number 1 contenders match, because I myself am not going to take it, that just feels utterly cheap, is going to be the winner of 2 other people who are sort of floating in this section of the table between Medee or Raymond, who obviously you're a little more familiar with, and Noah McCausland. So between those 2, what you know of them, who do you think has the edge there?
I like Medee in that matchup. I mean, I've seen them both go. I like Medee just because I feel he's a little more seasoned than Noah. I think Noah's going to get there. I think it might be I don't know if it's just like a natural speaking issue or a confidence issue, but I think Medee is a smoother operator with more persuasion. So I think he has the tools to beat Noah. No offense to Noah. I do believe he'll get there.
Absolutely. Well, John, thank you for competing against me tonight. I've had a joy. But until next time, we'll see you, sir. Take care. So I'll go ahead and put you in the back. And guys, that is going to be it for tonight's matchup. I'm not going to prolong this very much because, again, it always feels weird to like hype yourself up after you've won. But I want to thank John for a great match. It was incredible. I am happy to get another win, of course, because I said at the start of the year, my goal in this was to legitimize myself as a competitor, and winning 4 matches in a row is a good way to do that. But we will see where the future holds. With all that said, though, thank you guys for watching. Thank you to the judges, Jake, Maria, and Zach. I want to say thank you to John again, of course. Thank you to Kevin for writing the match. I really appreciate having the help there. And until next time, take care, everybody. We'll see you.